All right, so this is just a few slides on the rock cycle. Normally in class we would be doing pages 50 and 51 that are in the lab manual. That's a good activity. I can try to see if I can find it to post online. Basically, it's a series of stations that students go to and roll the dice that mimics the rock cycle. It's a good activity that you can easily do with middle school students. There's a similar version of it for the water cycle and some of the other cycles as well. It's a pretty common activity, but in lieu of that, not being able to do that, we're going to do yet another gizmo. So the gizmo that goes along with this, obviously, is the rock cycle. I think it gets at the same point that you can get to with the actual dice activity. So before we get into the rock cycle, just a few slides on metamorphic rocks, which we haven't talked about yet. So we've talked about the difference between rocks and minerals. We've talked about minerals and some of the tests that we do for minerals. Looked at sedimentary rocks and sediments. Looked at igneous rocks. There'll be an accompanying PowerPoint on volcanoes that goes along with the igneous rocks. The one that we haven't gotten to yet, but we'll get to, is metamorphic rocks. So I'm just going to say a couple things about metamorphic rocks, kind of as an overview, before we look at the whole cycle. Okay. So metamorphic rocks form from any other type of rock, right? So that means they form from sedimentary rocks, they form from igneous rocks, and they also form from other metamorphic rocks. Okay. So the term here that you see on the slide is protolith, which basically means the rock that it was before. What was it before? It's now the rock that we have in our hand that we're looking at. Okay, so through the process of metamorphism, one rock becomes another rock. And then the second bullet note here, normally when we talk about that, it's just easier and I guess cognitively less demanding to just say that that's due to heat and pressure, but it's also due to the chemical bearing fluids that are in the rock that change during the process of metamorphism, change the rock into another type. That's just a little, I think, cumbersome and more difficult to sort of conceptualize. So we tend to just say with increasing temperature and pressure, one rock metamorphosizes into another rock. But those chemical bearing fluids are also key. This next slide just gets at the multitude of ways that a rock can change from one type of rock to another. There's lots of ways that that heat and pressure can be applied. You see some of them here. You see an impact crater slamming into the earth, obviously adding some heat and pressure when it does that. And then there's some areas that undergo plate tectonics, which we'll get to here in a few weeks now. But there's plates moving, and those plates are colliding with one another. They're pulling apart from one another, and so this causes a lot of heat and pressure that can change rocks. Okay. So again, more on that when we get to the metamorphism slides. This just shows a typical sort of pathway, a very common pathway for a sedimentary rock, here shale, to be metamorphosized under sort of low grade, which means low temperature or low pressure or both, into slate. So shale becomes slate, and then with further increases in temperature and pressure, slate metamorphosizes into schist, which is a pretty common rock around here actually. And then schist can become gneiss, still a metamorphic rock, and then into migmatite. Okay, now if the temperature and pressure continue to increase, now we're at temperatures that are so high that this rock is going to melt, become magma, and now we're into an igneous rock. It's going to form something like granite. All right, so that's sort of the typical but simplified version of metamorphism. All right, on the next slide, which again we'll see again, we kind of differentiate metamorphic rocks into two main categories: foliated and non-foliated. Foliated just means it's been squeezed so much, almost like a deck of cards, that you squeeze it and shear it at the same time, and now it may have some banding, which looks like different layers, but it's actually different minerals that have been stretched out, and so we tend to see larger crystal grains here, but also some layering. All right, and so just a couple things for the rock cycle. Again, I think these become apparent from the gizmo activity. There is no one rock cycle, and this can be confusing for our students because when we think of other cycles, life cycle, life cycle of a caterpillar or something like that, it is in a set defined direction, right? One thing happens, the pupa stage happens, the next stage. And so that's a definitive thing. Whereas things like the rock cycle or the water cycle, it's a cycle, but there's different pathways, there's different processes that happen. Okay, so that's the key point, and that's the reason that the rolling the dice activity that's in the lab manual is a good activity, and again duplicated in the gizmo. All right. The other thing is it's hard to show the amount of time that is spent in these stages. So whether you're rolling the dice or looking at this this gizmo activity, different processes take different amounts of time, right? A volcano can erupt very quickly, but if you look at something like slow plates moving very slowly, adding pressure and temperature changes over much longer periods of time. Okay. So when we go through the rock cycle, just kind of keep that in mind that as things move through these different phases and go through different processes, they take different amounts of time. All right. And so the key points of the rock cycle is that, again, that any rock type can become any other rock type. Okay. So any rock can become any other type. Sedimentary can become metamorphic or igneous. Sedimentary can become another sedimentary rock, right? Metamorphic can become igneous or sedimentary, or metamorphic can become another type of metamorphic rock. There's really no starting point or end point. You might be able to argue that when the formation of the Earth, most rocks originated as igneous rocks, but looking at the cycle itself, there's no starting or end point to it. You just look at where a rock is now, or maybe what it was before. And again, it's a model of what can happen, not what will happen. And so, again, just because a rock is at one place on that cycle doesn't necessarily mean that we know what's going to happen to it next. Okay, so when we look at the rock cycle, here it is. We've got our three main types of sedimentary rocks: igneous rocks, metamorphic rocks, sedimentary rocks. And then what's more important are these arrows and the processes. The process, by process I mean things like melting and crystallizing, becoming buried and deposited over time. So those processes, if you look at them, there's a lot of arrows going on there. It's a pretty busy diagram, but all that to show that a sedimentary rock can weather, erode, become deposited as sediment, and then compact back into another sedimentary rock. Or a sedimentary rock can melt, become magma, crystallize, and form an igneous rock. Or a sedimentary rock can be buried and exposed to more heat and pressure and become a metamorphic rock, right? So any type of rock can become any other type of rock, and for that reason, there's lots of arrows here. And so what does that mean for you? It means if I cover up igneous rock here and ask you what goes here, you should be able to deduce from what's happening with these processes that that's igneous rock. Likewise, if I crossed out melting here, left that blank, and asked you what should go in that blank, you should be able to deduce that a sedimentary rock, in order to become magma, the process that has to happen is that it has to melt. Okay. So the assignment that goes along with this is the gizmo. And again, one of the take-home points that once you get from doing the gizmo is that if we go through this multiple times, we will get different pathways, right? So if we, same with the rolling the dice activity, that's kind of what it shows is every student in the classroom will have a different sequence of places on this processes and rocks that their own story. It's almost like a choose your own ending story if you ever read one of those. Each time we do this roll the dice, it's a different outcome that happens, and so there is no one rock cycle. Okay, so we can talk more about that when we meet in the Blackboard Collaborative Ultra. If you have any questions about rock cycles, we can discuss that next Tuesday. All right, see you then.